Nonprofit friends, welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about finance committees and other people of the board that could be kind of our greatest blessing or our worst nightmare. It kind of depends on that situation. I personally have served on finance committees and I have seen what works, what doesn't work, but I also have an interesting perspective of working with lots of nonprofits and different finance committees. And I've definitely seen the gamut of really effective ones and less effective ones. And I'm not alone. I am here with one of our very own CFOs, Trina Owens-Rogers. Trina, you also serve on many boards. I think you probably do more boards than I do, which is pretty impressive. So you also have a unique perspective of you and I had both worked for a nonprofit organization as a CFO, right? So we had the accountability to a finance committee and the CEO of the nonprofit organization. And then we serve on boards, right? And in finance committee, because we're accountants, so of course we're always the treasurer by default, it feels
By
like.
default.
And then,
Mm.
of course, you have a roster of clients and you interact with their board and finance committee on a regular basis. So you definitely have a lot that I think you can talk about with respect to finance committees. And finance committees are really important, kind of make it or break it for us at the Charity CFO. We have this concept of the Charity CFO Financial Blueprint. And this is essentially 30 principles that we've decided are the most important commonalities of really successful organizations. And number 25, no particular chronological order, but pretty high up on the list, even though it's lower on the principles list.
Yes.
Number 25 is having an effective finance committee. And we're going to be talking about that and diving into that a little bit more. So let's just start there. Let's start simple. Trinae, in your experience, what do you think is the real purpose of a finance committee? Or put differently, what should they be doing?
I think your keyword there was effective finance committee. So I want to
Mm-hmm.
say that much, effective finance committee. And so the first thing, right, their first role is board oversight. And we say oversight as opposed to management because you're not
Mm-hmm.
managing the organization, it's the oversight of the organization. And so that finance committee is specifically there to review the financials regularly. I would expect at least quarterly. You prefer monthly, but at least quarterly.
Mm-hmm.
They can support with budgeting, help with the audit. And then, of course, when you have your audits, you want to make sure that you have someone that's communicating between the staff, the auditors, and then also with the other board members. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's the function of the finance committee in a nutshell.
And I know in our work, like I've seen again, and we're going to dive in this here on common pitfalls
Yeah.
of finance committees and where things can really go wrong. But you shared something, and the responsibility is oversight. Typically, the finance committee is a committee of the board, and typically the treasurer of the board serves as the chair of that committee. And you talked about they're not responsible for the management of of the finances, although we are going to get into that later on. We see that happen at times, but really they're intended to be a bridge between working with the internal management team, really understanding, digging in, asking all the hard questions about the finances, and then typically relaying that to the board. But so
Mhm.
oftentimes I also see, which will again, I'm trying to get ahead of myself, not trying to, rather. But I see sometimes that finance committees are not equipped or comfortable or confident in being able to relay that financial information to the board. So hopefully your treasurer, which is the chair of your finance committee, is the one communicating and summarizing the financial results or other compliance matters like tax returns or audit results, things like that. That person is also kind of disseminating that information from wherever they're getting it, outside CPAs, internal teams, outsourced accounting firms like us, whatever it might be. And they're disseminating that information, summarized it in a way that's, understandable and digestible to the higher level board. I know, Trina, that's kind of our golden standard that the treasurer has enough information to feel comfortable doing that. Although I
Right.
know for some organizations, we're still a bit of an evolution there.
Yes.
So we've kind of hinted a little bit on these common issues, or maybe to put it a little bit differently, when finance committees are not effective. What are some of these common issues that you see with finance committees in the nonprofit space?
Well, you talked about the treasurer being knowledgeable about finances, right? You need
Mhm.
at least one person on that finance committee that knows how to read financials, knows how to interpret the information, and again, ask the difficult questions. Because anytime you receive a financial report, there should be a question. Even if it's a beautiful report, you have all the cash in the world, there should be
Mhm.
questions to get more information. And so you need at least one of the members on the finance committee to be financially literate. So
Mhm.
someone with maybe a business background, not necessarily accountant, but a business background of some sort.
Mhm.
Um, and then another issue I typically see is management, right? I always say
Mhm.
the board is oversight. And so there's a thin line where you cross over into managing the finance team. And it's
Mhm.
okay to make requests and, suggest questions or maybe suggestions. But let's say, they're trying to put a process in place. That's not
Mhm.
necessarily the goal or the role of the finance committee. That's the
Mhm.
management. So between the ED and the CFO, or in our case, the outsourced CFO to put certain processes in place, or
Exactly.
policy. And so we tend to have finance committees that might kind of cross that line into management and micromanagement of the team.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and then, of course, even worse are finance committees that never meet. So maybe you just have a finance committee in name. Um,
Mhm.
maybe they don't even know they're a finance committee. They just think they're part of this board and they don't know that they're a subset of the board that's supposed
Mhm.
to focus on the financials and make sure that they truly understand everything so that they can then deliver it right to the board in confidence, saying that this subset of the board has read the financials, understand the financials, asked all the difficult questions, and now we're giving you a brief summary.
Right.
So have a committee that does not meet, that's a problem as well. And so
Yeah.
those are just a few things that I've noticed in finance committees, boards that have finance committees.
I absolutely agree. It's a spectrum of over engagement and under
Uh-huh.
engagement,
Mhm.
and somewhere in the middle is the ideal,
Exactly.
right? I've definitely seen the under engagement where the board as a whole doesn't meet or not actively involved
Yes.
in the management of thing of the oversight of the organization. But then I definitely, and I know Trina, you've had to personally experience this as well,
Mhm.
where it's really hard as the accountant to understand who their actual supervisor
Yes.
is.
Yes.
And because the treasurer or the individuals on a finance committee change,
Mhm.
the vibe of that
Mhm.
individual person and their experience and interaction with, let's just call leadership within the
Yes.
organization, right? Because it's a constantly changing finance committee, board, et cetera, as you bring new members on, roll members off. And sometimes you'll get a really eager treasurer that really has a hard time finding that boundary between management, which is the
Yes.
CEO's job, right?
Correct.
And oversight, right? And asking, like you said, just be curious, ask the questions, kind of
Yeah.
poke holes in the reports and the budget, especially to make sure we haven't missed anything, or
Mhm.
to offer guidance when it's asked about. I do just kind of want to double click on one thing, though. I think it's really important, and we see so often that financial management is a really tricky thing in the nonprofit world because the people that are running organizations sometimes, but not always, they don't necessarily have a business background. They didn't go to certainly didn't go to business school necessarily, or maybe they have an MBA, but oftentimes they don't. And I see so many leaders of nonprofits really overly rely on their finance committee and use them as a quasi management function. And that becomes really tricky because a finance committee, they only have so much
Yeah.
authority. They only have so much power. And it's also just like uncomfortable and weird. And at the end of the day, we've seen our best clients really that CEO owning the responsibility of managing the financial function, even if that's not their background or expertise, but they take ownership, they take responsibility, and they essentially serve as like the final decision maker for, like you said, Trinae, like certain processes that are going to be put in
Yes.
place or identifying red flags. And so I think as much as a finance committee sometimes can be over engaged, but
Yeah.
sometimes that's because we as leaders of nonprofits, we allow them to be, right? And so
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that some EDs don't have that financial background. And so they rely heavily on the board, not knowing, especially if they have an outsourced accountant, especially if they have an in-house CFO, that that's your expert. And so what I tell my clients all the time is it's okay if you don't know anything about budgeting because that's why you have a CFO. It's
Yeah.
okay if you're not 100% sure about these financials because that's what I'm here for, to
Hmm.
interpret those financials for you so that you can be confident when you go to the board, whether I'm attending the board meetings as well, or if you're then delivering it to the board. I make sure that those EDs are confident in those financials. So, it's not always required that an ED have a background in accounting because, again,
Hmm.
that's what your outsourced CFO is for. I'm there to
Exactly.
support you in that aspect of things. So,
And I'll just say, I think kind of an example that I see, and again, this is not as uncommon as you all listening might think, that we've had even just recently, in the middle of onboarding a client that knew that they had some personnel issues. CEO knew they had some personnel issues in their financial function. They want to bring us into, in tandem with like the finance committee to kind of oversee the accounting function. There's some personnel issues. The folks are just not the right people in the right seat. And see, this particular CEO really had hoped that an outside consultant and in conjunction with the finance committee can solve the personnel problems. And that's an example of a
mm,
bit of an overstep of the finance committee with the assumption that they're going to be able to fix that because maybe they have a little bit more of an understanding of what an account should or shouldn't do, which we can get into. Like finance committees, not necessarily just because they have a financial background that they're actually equipped. Something that you kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, Trinae. But I think it's really, really important for CEOs to push back on those kind of micromanaging treasurers and finance committees because sometimes when you create that dynamic, it's hard to pull back from that.
mhm.
And I really try to be careful when I'm on a board, even though I have expertise, right, in the accounting of nonprofits, certainly I really, really try to keep an arm's length so that it's not me overstepping and getting into active management. So I've seen it kind of both ways so many times in my career, and I know Trina, you have as well.
Yeah. And you know what? I try to understand sometimes where the finance committees are coming from, right? Because we do
Mhm.
understand when there are personnel issues, unfortunately, that finance committee does have to step up and sometimes do more than they want to do.
Mhm.
But the key thing is recognizing when you do get the personnel, when you do get the right staff in place, that you then have to go back into that oversight role. And that's when
Mhm.
it gets hard because then you have finance committees that have, they've had to operate as a more managing role or a more working board, as I like to call it. Um,
Mhm.
those
Mhm.
working boards and then they don't know once you get good people in place, it's okay to step back now. It's okay to go back into that oversight role. And, which, you think they would, be okay with, but it's sometimes a little difficult to let that reign go. So it's hard
Yeah.
once you open that door to then shut it back.
I agree. And I want to go back to something else that we talked about a little bit before as well, before we move on to kind of good examples of what a finance committee could look like.
Uh-huh.
Um, some of the areas that we've struggled with at times, more on the disengagement side of a finance committee, is any sort of interaction with us as outsourced CFO teams,
Yeah.
or I know even auditors. I mean, having your finance committee show up to a committee so that the auditors can present the results, or even reviewing the financial reports that your team is putting, your outsourced team, for example, is putting together. I will say I've typically, when I worked for a nonprofit, I had a pretty engaged finance team. I think part of that's probably a dynamic of my personality as well. I don't know, but I do know that it's really important for the finance committee to have a bit of a dotted line to their accountants because I know that we've certainly had some, shall we call it, less than ideal
Yeah. Yeah.
situations
Yeah.
with our nonprofit clients where technically we report to the CEO. At least that's kind of how we look at it, right? Just as if we were
Exactly.
a CFO of that organization. That's how we like to approach it. But at times, the CEO is a bit of the challenge, right? We can't
That's true.
get best practices put in place. We can't beef up the internal controls as we'd hoped. We're having barriers for compliance. The financial reporting for funders maybe is lacking in some ways because we can't get documentation from. And oftentimes, the tone starts at the top, as the saying goes. And it's tricky because if we don't have that dotted line to the finance committee to say, hey, these need to be priorities of the organization, if there's not that kind of feedback loop and that kind of open,
Mhm.
transparent kind of interaction, it can become tricky for your accounting team to kind of speak up and raise the red flag on like, hey, we might need some additional help or support here. So I do
Mhm.
think it's important that the finance committee does still develop a rapport and relationship with the accountant, with
Absolutely.
whether it's an outsourced team, internal team, and the auditors, because if there
Yeah.
are issues, and sometimes it does happen, we've seen it certainly, where the CEO is oftentimes the barrier for success, then
Oh, yeah.
how would the finance committee or board ever know if that communication ever happened? I know, Trina, you've dealt with this experience before.
My ideal finance committee meeting is the ED, myself, the CFO, and then of course the finance committee. If I've never met the finance committee, if I've never, and I don't have to be on every meeting, but if I've
Mhm.
never met the finance committee, that's almost a red flag for me, right?
Mhm.
Because they should want to hear from your top financial person, right?
Mhm.
So I should be in direct communication with that finance, with the
Mhm.
treasurer, basically. So
Mhm.
again, even if it's just the ED, myself and the treasurer, and then the treasurer then goes and takes things back to the finance committee. So if I have not met the finance committee, if I have not met the treasurer at least a couple times a year, for me, usually that presents some sort of red flag because again, they should want to hear from me.
Mhm.
I know I'm reaching out to them to, I'm
Mhm.
asking, well, again, because technically I report to the ED, I'm saying, hey, I'm sending you this report. What does your treasurer have to say about it?
Sure.
I'm asking that question, not necessarily what they want to see. What
Mhm.
does your treasurer say? What does your treasurer want to see? Do
Right.
you want to hop on a call with your treasurer? So ideally, they are in direct communication with me, but also that makes them familiar with me. That way, if I do have to say, hey, I'm missing this information for whatever reason, then that's why we're comfortable speaking to one another because I've developed that relationship with the treasurer as well. So, and again, it goes back to being an effective finance
Yeah.
committee because
Right.
if they're reading the reports, and we have an issue with say the ED giving us documentation, they should see that in those reports if they're
Mhm.
really paying attention.
Mhm.
Uh,
Maybe you're describing it now, but can you give any other insights on, what an effective finance committee looks like, or like a successful
mhm.
example of maybe something, a situation that came up that was like, hey, that was actually pretty mitigated because it was an effective
Yeah.
finance committee. I don't know. Anything else you want to add on like this is what our like your favorite perfect client and their
Yeah.
finance committee does. Paint a picture of what that looks like. If there's anything else you would add.
Absolutely. So again, an effective finance committee asks questions. If I present a report and I don't get any questions, I'm assuming you didn't read it and you didn't listen to what I said. If you just
Hmm.
said it's good to go, that tells me that you're not, well, in my opinion, not really doing the work. So I have a few clients that have very involved finance committees. And so I'll just talk about one example. They noticed health insurance was trending over budget. Now, for
Hmm.
me, it wasn't significant. Usually, for that particular client, if it's 2 or 3 thousand off in a month, it's not a big deal. Doesn't raise any red flags because,
Hmm.
as you know, organizations with high turnover
Hmm.
have constant changes to health insurance bills as
Right.
employees enrolled, termed, and whatnot. So
Right.
again, it wasn't a red flag for me. But of course, if the finance committee asks a question, I'm going to drill into it so that I can give a
Hmm.
a specific answer. So in this instance, I'm glad they asked the question because once I drilled down into it, we recognized that the employee portion, well, the employer portion was too high because we didn't properly increase the
Oh,
employee portion of the health insurance. So
on the payroll side. Mm.
correct. On the when you have open enrollment and let's say the employees portions kind of increases just even if it's
Mm.
$10, the employer portion was a little bit too high. So again, because of this effective board that's actually reading these things. And again, it wasn't
Hmm.
significant for the CFO for me because I'm like, oh, it's $2,000 off. It'll probably be $2,000 less next month.
Right.
But because they asked the question, and again, this is not an organization that has money issues or so they don't have many problems, but
Hmm.
again, they asked a question. And so that's
Hmm.
how we were able to find that issue. And let's be honest, had that drug on for months, that would have hurt the staff member,
Yeah.
right? Because you have a
Right.
staff member that is underpaying health
Hmm.
insurance. So again, very involved finance committee that asked questions. So
Mm. I love
that
that.
worked out. Yeah. Yeah.
So I know you have some horror stories. Let's flip the script a little bit and give me, hypothetical,
Mm.
tale of,
Hypothetical.
hypothetical of maybe in a finance committee that wasn't effective and the impact that it had on the organization.
So, unfortunately, I have seen this a couple of times. You get a new client and they have a large payroll liability.
This would be my example, and I'm sure they're different clients too.
And
Yes.
and that means that payroll taxes have not been paid
Mhm.
timely to the IRS, which, as you know, results in significant penalties to the organization. And so if I see, again, as a new client, I see a large balance, that tells me that this finance committee saw this balance growing, right?
Right.
And didn't ask the question. So if you see any liability growing month to month, as opposed to shrinking, right? Liability is money that's owed that the organization needs to pay, right? Um, it should be shrinking, right? Think about a mortgage. It goes down because you're paying it every month. Same
Hmm.
thing, your payroll liability, it should be going down. But if you see that amount growing, you should
Right.
be asking some questions. And so, unfortunately, I've seen we've seen a few new clients come in with large payroll liabilities, and we have to help them clean that up and get that paid out and, communicate with the IRS, about moving forward. And that
Right.
those are my scariest moments that, make me say, okay, finance committee, you have to read this stuff because the finance committee should have noticed it. And I hope the ED knew, you know, but to be on them, to constantly every month to say, hey, are you getting this fixed? What are you doing to mitigate this? Are you sending this money in?
Hmm.
'Cause sometimes, as you know, the EDs get busy. But if that finance committee, again, oversight, says, hey, give us the information on this, then they'll make sure it's done,
Hmm.
right? If that committee's in place asking the questions.
Exactly. And I want to reiterate what you were saying. Payroll liabilities in and of itself may not seem so off the wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say there's probably some of my horror stories as well. And oftentimes these are new clients we inherit and they're like, okay, here's
Yes.
our accounting system. And then we start looking
Yeah.
at like if the
That's not
payroll liability keeps growing every single month and the amount of staff has not grown, you would
exactly.
expect that payroll liability to stay about the same because it's,
Yeah.
it gets accumulated and then it gets paid off the next month and then it accumulates
Right.
again and paid off the same month. But if it keeps building,
It keeps
that's
growing.
definitely a red flag. And we've
Mhm.
had numerous situations,
Yeah.
even as recently as the last few months, where we had a new client that came on board. Come to find out, their in-house accountant was not paying payroll taxes for several months.
Yes.
It was just, I guess, an oversight. But once we got into the accounting
Mhm.
system, we started realizing, hey, you should expect those payroll taxes to go out along with your payroll checks, right, or
Yep.
deposits nowadays. And it
Yep.
wasn't, and no one was asking the questions about why does this keep growing and growing and growing.
Exactly.
And to your point, Trinae, that liability doesn't include now all the fines and penalties assessed, which were
Oh, no.
substantial, tens of thousands of dollars.
Oh, yeah.
And no one was asking those questions. So
Mhm.
it was, and I've seen this happen time and time again, and it's just simply not asking, you know, those questions. Yeah.
Because it's not up to the finance committee to fix that problem, right? You're just saying, hey, I see this. Can you give me some information? That's all you need to say. And then that'll make that ED go, uh-oh, uh-oh, I missed something. Let me make sure I take care of this before that next meeting, right? You just need that, that oversight, that person looking over your shoulder going, oh, what's that? And the same thing with retirement contributions. I've seen that.
Hmm.
That number grows. The retirement contributions, if you're supposed to be making those contributions, they have to be timely. Think about the interest that you're missing
Right.
if you don't pay into that, if you don't pay into it timely. So that's another one that,
Hmm.
you could be liable for the interest that the staff member, especially if it was their withholdings,
Hmm.
you could be liable for that interest that they're losing. So again,
Absolutely.
just simply asking the question, be curious,
Exactly.
if you don't really know what it is, ask the question.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. Okay, so some people might be listening like, I don't even have a finance committee.
Uh-huh.
what would it look like to start building a finance committee? Maybe they just have a board and they have a treasurer because oftentimes that's legally required by certain states to have at least like a president, vice president, treasurer, some variation of positions within a board. Treasurer is usually required by most states. If you were to build a finance committee from scratch based on what we talked about like financial acumen and maybe expertise in certain areas, maybe well-rounded business mindset. Trinae, where would you advise an
Mhm.
ED to start? Or if this is a board member listening, like, hey, we need to put a finance committee together.
Absolutely. So sometimes boards are so small, right? You only have the officers, as you mentioned. You have the president, the vice president, the secretary, and the treasurer. That's the full board. Well, you just need one person that has that financial background. So hopefully that's your
Mm-hmm.
treasurer. Your treasurer should have a finance background. And then you, the treasurer, and the ED can meet. And then maybe one other board member, right? So that's two board members. And then you all meet quarterly and making sure, of course, you're taking your minutes because you need to have documented minutes of your
Mm-hmm.
meetings, of your
Mm-hmm.
quarterly meetings. And then, of course, you want to involve, as I mentioned before, you always want to involve your CFO in those
Mm-hmm.
meetings as well. Your auditor, when it's audit time, your auditor should present to that finance committee.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what else? Budget season. So if your ED and your CFO, if they are creating the budget, you want to make sure your finance committee is reviewing that budget before it's getting approved by the board.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what else? The reports, of course, the financials, the monthly financials, your finance committee should be reviewing that. So, and as I keep saying, just making sure that they ask the questions and, but again, if you just have your treasurer, your CFO, and your ED at minimum,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe, like I said, maybe one other board member, you got
Yep.
a finance committee. Yeah.
I I'll add to that too, just for practical steps on where do I find these people? I really want to reiterate too that a lot of times I will kind of be introduced with a finance committee, and maybe they all have an investment background, or they might have a banking background. And
Mm-hmm.
that is a great start, but also it's nice, just like anything, like finance and accounting experience is not a one size fits all. There are different
No,
expertise across the board. So if your organization has, for example, an endowment or some sort of investments, it's really great to
yeah,
get an investment person on there. If
correct.
they are involved in complicated banking matters like tax credit programs or financing for buildings or some weird things like that, having somebody in the banking industry is really helpful. Is your point to Trinity that we've talked about in the past, like having some sort of background with just savviness on how to read financial reports. Sometimes that's somebody that's coming out of the audit world or public accounting world, not necessarily if you can't, but finding a kind of a variety of talent as it makes sense for your organization. I agree with you, Trinity. At a
Yeah.
minimum, your treasurer should be pretty savvy on reading financial reports, but know that there is a variety of different talent on the financial space. And so, what I typically do, I think about what type of talent do I need on the finance committee?
Yeah.
And recognize that just because someone's, and I don't know how your bylaws are structured for everybody out there listening, but you might want to take a look. Sometimes your finance committee, they don't have to necessarily be members of your board, they could be advisors
That's
to your
true.
organization.
That's
And that's
true.
a nice pipeline for future board members. And if it is allowed that your committee members don't have to be active board members, you
Right.
can go out to investment
Mm-hmm.
banking firms, wealth management firms, public accounting firms, audit groups, that sort of thing. And you could reach out to those businesses to see if they have, financial minded individuals that are interested in serving in that capacity. And typically, if they're not super familiar with your organization, but like your mission, being on the committee is a far lighter lift than just being on the
Correct.
full board and the committee at the same time. So if you're struggling with building that financial expertise within your organization, kind of think about what that might look like for your firm or for your organization. And maybe that'll be some practical tips to help as well, in
Absolutely.
addition to everything that you just shared, Trinae. Okay, well, any other thoughts before we wrap up this conversation on finance committees? I know this is a topic that so many people, it's either a blessing or a curse, it feels like. And I know it's a heavy thing for some
Yeah.
CEOs. I've heard all of the different stories
Yeah.
and have seen variations all across the spectrum of the underengaged and overengaged. Um, any other tips or thoughts before we wrap up, Trinae?
No, I think we hit everything. The main thing is just get some people that are going to ask questions. Again, no questions, red
Mhm.
flag. It's
Yeah.
like, did
Yeah.
you read it? Did you read this
Exactly.
report? So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Good. So, yeah, I think so oftentimes finance committees are misunderstood, and I think that's typically the case because sometimes we're not really clear on what we're looking for from them. Like we talked about earlier, drawing boundaries and having, keeping their role to an oversight only.
Yes.
We've talked about the finance committee and why we believe that's important and really mission critical for any effective nonprofit organization out there. If you want more insights like this, or you want to see the full financial blueprint, again, this is our 30-point guide for all of the common themes that we've seen with our most successful clients. If you want to go there, go to our website under the resource tab and download the financial blueprint, or we'll drop that link here in the show notes. I want to thank you all so much again for joining me. Trina, thank you for taking time out of your busy day for having this conversation. And we'll see you next time on a Modern Nonprofit podcast. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.